curious, can you tell me a little bit about what you've been up to recently? You said you're an assistant professor in Michigan.
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at Northern Michigan University in the Department of Communication and Media Studies. So, yeah, I've been teaching a lot lately. It's kind of that point of the semester where you're just keeping your head down until early May. Obviously doing edits on this piece, working on some other essays as well, sitting at home and playing guitar a little bit and planning trips for the summer. So playing a trip to Canyonlands National Park in the summer and a few other trips. I've got a family reunion, kind of planning some trips around those kind of things, which is more than anything, it's kind of getting me through the winter, right? By dreaming of getting out into the summer road trip or something. So
yeah, what classes do you teach right now?
I'm teaching small group and team communication. I'm teaching communication theory, which is like communication theory, but also like rhetorical theory and critical cultural study. There's critical cultural, like post-structural theory, that kind of stuff is in there as well. The last class is intercultural communication.
You told me once in our earlier editing meetings that you've done a lot of writing, as obviously you have your PhD, you've published literature papers, and that this is one of your first times, I guess, publishing fiction. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it's been writing fiction compared to what you're used to?
Yeah, it's been a learning process. I mean, this piece took me 6 years, you know what I mean? Like, this is now 7 years. I mean, this is like knowing what to say, doing research on some of the kind of elements of nonlinear ontologies and quantum mechanics and things, right? To make sure that there's legitimacy in the philosophical background of things. But then a lot of that was just like figuring out like what makes for a good story, right? Like reading books on constructing stories, right? And like how narrative works, and really diving into narrative theory a bit more from a pragmatic perspective, right? And so there's still a lot that like the editing's been helpful with, because obviously sometimes like telling instead of showing, right, can be certainly a feature of, let's say, nonfiction academic writing, and so learning to trust the reader, right? Like trust the reader that they'll be able to put together some of these things when you just kind of describe characteristic details or setting details or behavior, and learning that and really just like learning like what it means to intensify a character's situation, intensify a plot line, create dilemmas that they have to face, create questions that like the reader wants answered. Really diving into like all those kind of like aspects of fiction writing that there really aren't what I would typically have done. But it's been great. I mean, I've felt really like ironically more freedom through fiction to be able to kind of theorize in a way, right? Like I don't know, it's allowed me to kind of open and pursue some complex questions that, like something like nonfiction and academic writing, there's an urge to answer it. There's an urge to have a final kind of conclusion. This has enabled me to say like some things are really too complex for easy conclusions, and the best you can do is work it out by figuring out how characters would respond to situations.
I did not know that this story was 6-7 years in the making. So can you tell us a little bit about how this story was inspired and what made you want to write it?
The one aspect of it that maybe, inspired it all was, one thing that did happen to me was like getting this first academic job back, like at the place where I was born, that I had no sense of like why, I know like but it always hung with me, like that place, it always stuck with me. And then to not have any memory of it, no sense of the details surrounding it, to end up moving back there. And it was just this jarring experience. I started spending a lot of time by this creek. And then I wrote, like, there's this kind of moment in the story, right, where like details about the creek are repeated. So that I wrote like that as a descriptive scene of this creek, and then I realized that was connected to a bigger story and a bigger narrative, and that it had to be told through fiction. It couldn't be told, in the way I usually tell things. And so I started that, writing that, and then that was like kind of hung around with me, this descriptive scene, right? Like there's something here, right? About like there's something connected to this scene here. And then in the meantime, I had been kind of going through this moment where, I was an atheist my whole life, as far as I can remember after, being an adult. And I had just been starting to go through these moments where that version of the world was no longer tenable to me, in terms of like things started happening that were alignments, or were what we normally call coincidences or deja vus or something like that, where it's like, oh, God damn it. There's something, right? There's something more intelligent, and we're a part of something that's more intelligent. Then I changed it into like trying to write a philosophical piece, and I was like, oh, that's not right. Yeah. And then I just kind of had this sense that like, follow through with this, right? Like figure it out, turn it into a story, and then see where it goes, and see if you can answer some of these questions that you have about life at this moment in that way and through that format. And so, yeah, that's obviously the 6 or 7, it wasn't like every day I'm working on it for that long, it was like, I throw it away, like, oh, I can't, whatever, you put it away, and then you'll be sitting there on a Friday night or something, like want to do some writing, and then you'll like, I would search through my email and say, where's that draft of that, and then pull it back out and that kind of thing. So.
And I'm sure like the heart behind the story was always kind of in the back of your mind, and you were always processing it as life went by. And especially now that you tell me, it sounds like the story in a way reflects some of your experiences as well, as you begin to ask questions about life. And can you actually tell me a little bit about where you grew up? Because in the story, the main character grows up in Virginia, and I don't know if that is similar to you.
Yeah, so I was born in Virginia, and then my family did move away when I was 1, and then I grew up in North Carolina at that point. So I lived most of my life in the South in North Carolina. Well, most of my young life until I was 12 or 13, and then moved to Michigan, moved to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan after that. But I spent most of my formative years young in Statesville and Troutman, North Carolina, which is just north of Charlotte. Yeah, it was a pretty interesting place to leave, and then at a young age. And then I don't know how much you know about like kind of U.S. regional, differences. Yeah, but there are regional differences between, say, the Southeast and the Upper Midwest. There are cultural differences. So yeah, a lot of my young life was moving from Virginia to North Carolina, and then moving to Michigan. A lot of moving around. I since it's created a life of moving around, but which is unfortunate, I think, sometimes. But yeah, North Carolina and Virginia. So.
Oh, I see. And also, I was wondering, for the 2 main characters in your story, we have Dan, who, I don't want to give any spoilers, but we have Dan and we have Wilson. Dan, one of his, I guess, motivations is to prove himself to people, and to make people proud, especially the people that he loves. And then Wilson, he is also a professor, and he's trying to figure out some answers. Do you feel like there's a character that resonates with you the most in the story?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think obviously Wilson's occupation is suggestive in some of the things there. I get both, like what they're going through, I get what they're going through in terms of trying to make somebody proud, or like trying to validate something that you're doing off of some sort through some sort of external mechanism, right? Like using an external mechanism to be your validation mechanism. And in my experience in life, that often doesn't lead to great consequences, when you're like trying to, instead of just kind of being in the flow of existence, or instead of just doing what you need to do what is right. I think sometimes, I know in myself, one of the things I've tried to work on is to not be driven by some sort of pride that might follow from defining self-concept and self-worth through external forces, right? And so, but that was certainly my experience, I mean, like I got into academia because, I wasn't like the best student at a younger age in terms of, I was a good student at a younger age, but then I kind of got into trouble and stuff, and so, and kind of lived, a kind of nihilistic, I guess it's, and so, but I had kind of like people that started to treat me in a certain way, and in correspondence with that, and in a certain way that I don't know that I liked. So, it led me to like like, you don't know how smart I am. If only you would see how smart I was, right? If you could see that, like, you would just be. So then I ended up going down a path that kind of did that. And so, and then at some point around the time that I really started seriously writing the story, actually, I realized that, like, I couldn't define my academic existence according to these external sources of validation. And in fact, maybe a lot of my entire academic career had been built on external sources of validation, and that this was a time when I needed to find meaning in that pursuit that was deeper, longer lasting, maybe like more metaphysical beyond like this singular moment, right, in my history of existence. And so how do you find that? How do you find that deeper validation when you've built up a life around pride, right? You've built up a life around trying to prove something to someone. But I think that's complicated with both Dan and WT too, because for Dan, it's not just pride, it's also the love of agriculture, right? The love of agricultural work. Like, he wants to farm, he wants to like, yes, it's pride, but it's also like just loving the work. And I think the same thing is true for WT, right? Like, loving the work of thinking, of trying to figure out these questions, of these answers. But maybe, like, unfortunately, both characters have woven that love of labor with some sort of something else, which is maybe inhibiting their happiness, right? Yeah.
And they're also, in the story there are Dan and WT's partners, who are an active member of their life, and who, I guess, kind of challenge them to think about, the life that they're living and the habits that they've fallen into. Do you have any people also that in your life that might have inspired some of these people in the story?
There's probably more than one partner who's been like, what I find interesting about WT's response to or relationship with Emily and Dan's relationship with Marie is that, like, they never know with complete certainty what the other person is thinking or feeling, and they're kind of two in their own head to be able to actually fully understand that. And it's a kind of an unfortunate, maybe, right, like, part of it. But yeah, I've had people in my life, I think, that like truly care about maybe some of the things that are that I'm struggling with, you know what I mean, that truly, like, really care. But even their own care, it also remains tied up with some dreams that they have, right? Some version of the future that they're striving for. And they see that a character who's striving for a dream, and then this other character who's striving for a dream, and maybe those dreams aren't compatible, but maybe that care and concern that runs so deep makes you want those dreams to become compatible, right? Makes you want those futures to end up being the same, because even though they're not, there's a reality to that care and concern that people might be able to show you, that you just want to maintain, even though maybe you shouldn't, so all the time. So I guess, does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, it does make sense. Like, I definitely felt like there was a lot of love between the main characters, Dan and Marie, and Emily and WT, but also a lot of expectation that we see in how their partners want them to be, and versus where they actually are and what they need for themselves in the moment. And so, again, without like spoilers, I think there was a critical moment in the story where I guess all the main characters had to kind of surrender the outcomes and kind of just go with the flow of life.
Yeah, and that's is that, you never know. I guess that's the question, is like, how do you know if that's right or not, right? Like, how do you know if that was the right call? But maybe, like, that's the problem, is like always trying to control everything, right? Like, maybe that's like ultimately what the issue is. So, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of love. And I think, I've had those things in my life, right? For sure. Where you just wish you could do what you needed to do for the other person, but maybe that involves surrendering something of your desire to control an outcome.
And now, so moving towards a bit more about your writing process, and yeah, like how this story came to be. First of all, do you have a favorite place that you love to write?
Yeah, I think I mostly write in my office these days. I live in like a shitty falling down house, in the woods. Not in the woods. It's a small little town. It's really quiet, and there's hardly anything that goes on, mostly. And so I like being quiet out there. I used to write in coffee shops a lot. I still do write in coffee shops a lot, but I easily get distracted from coffee shops. So if I'm doing the invention part, the part of inventing an idea, I want to be in the place, right? So, there's been a part of me that so when I was inventing this story, I had to be in that creek, right? I had to be right there for a lot of the early moments and just try to write down what's going on in my head, right? Because I think figuring out the invention, figuring out what the topic of the story is involves relating to that place and being in that place and figuring out what story exists in that place, right? And so for me, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, that inventing a story or inventing anything, whatever artistic enterprise you're inventing, I think it's instead of thinking it as emerging from the internal mechanisms of the human and having an externalization outward from the internal, the inventor is the creator is the human. I think that's maybe the wrong way to look at it, right? I think I've been thinking about it lately as the human as the apparatus in the fracks that filters, the channels, the muse, right? The old idea of the muse, right? But what that means is the story already exists in the world. The photograph already exists in the world. The painting already exists. It already exists in the terms of the story in the realm of possibility, right? It has a real existence as a possible object. And maybe the invention goal, the inventor's goal, the creator's goal is to channel that object and figure out how to bring it into existence, right? To actualize it in reality. And now it's going to be different for every writer, every painter, because the apparatus is different. The mechanism that is taking a possible object and actualizing that into a real object is different. So I think that's the way it is. So when I'm writing those initial moments of trying to be creative or inventive, to be in that place, because that's how I kind of try to access the world and all the possible objects that exist in that world, is by accessing place, by relating to place and kind of figuring out how I can channel what's out there into an actual existence. But then when it comes to editing and stuff, I can't have other things going around, so I would write in my office, but as you can see here, there's no windows. So I have to have some yeah.
Oh, I can imagine being in the place. It really helps you stay inspired and kind of grasp at those words that you need to actualize the story that, as you said, already is there. You're just trying as the inventor to put it together. So were you at a creek, I'm guessing, when you were writing a big part of your story with a notebook in hand, just sitting on a rock writing, or?
Yeah, the early parts of it. Yeah. And there's maybe a paragraph and a half that is in there still from that, it's all changed significantly. I wish I still had the notebooks and stuff that I was writing it all, but trying to figure out all the elements of it. It did involve sitting there, and I would sit there often. And so yeah, when I was living in Virginia, I only lived there for a year or so, but when I was living there, I would go to that creek and just try to channel all right, this is a strange occurrence. Let's see what the hell the world has to say. So it was a thing, right? Because like I said, I'd been so secular for so long, and then to have something like that happen, where you say, well, okay, well, there's I just have to assume this isn't a coincidence. Right? Let me just assume that, right? And then let's follow that assumption. What's going to follow from that assumption? And so, yeah.
And is there anything that inspires you to write beyond, I guess, your desire to answer life's questions?
Most of it is answering questions. Honestly, that's something that'll pop in my head and I'll have a desire to answer that question. And the question is whether or not it's done through scientific, or humanistic or, literary criticism or whatever, or if it's done through in this case, creative fiction writing pursuit. But it wasn't something that's been in my head this whole time, lately, is my dad passed and I didn't finish the story until after he passed, and he passed in December 2020, and it was kind of an intense, like sudden passing, and but I remember like one thing he had told me, like when I was in community college, and like I said, I wasn't that good of a student in high school and stuff, and went to community college, and then kind of everything turned around, right? Like I remember I had a literary criticism class, and I was like, oh shit, like we can just sit here and like discuss this is awesome. But I remember like my dad used to drop me off and pick me up some days between like community college and work, and I remember he told me like one time, and it just kind of came out of nowhere, but he said, whatever you do, just don't stop writing, right? Like and I don't remember why he told me that. I don't remember what it was, but he must have, something made him say it. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, I guess, like that, like what's one way I can help respect his existence, you know? And I think that's one way I can do that. So
yeah, it sounds like he saw something in you, his son, that maybe you didn't see in yourself at the moment. And yeah, and now here you are writing this awesome story. Like I'm so excited to have people read it in issue 1. And like as we read along, like with every word, we can tell how much thought that you've put into it and how much emotion and feeling that you've put into every sentence and phrase. A big part of that you have been telling us is the editing process, which even before we started recording, you mentioned that it can be painful at times. What would you say is the most challenging part about the editing process, and how do you feel like you get through that?
Yeah, like doubt. So that's doubt, right? Like self-doubt, that like there's always doubt, like and worry sometimes when I submitted something. It's like when I submit something, I know I've got it to a place where I'm okay with people reading it, right? And so that takes a long time, a lot of pain. So there's that. But then there's like, in this case of like the fiction thing too, it's like different phrases you include or different words you include have the consequence or potential to really change the character's outlook, the character's like who they are as a character, how they react. And so like trying to stay consistent with that too, like consistent with that while also being open to the fact that things are going to grow, things are going to evolve. And that editing process is really about growth and things evolving, especially after somebody else has read it, right? So, and now you've got feedback that you can use to grow and evolve these characters, the storyline and stuff. And I don't know, it's just, like I said, it's like opening up a wound, you know, that's the only way I can describe it. Like you've sealed this wound, like it's a little bit of a scar, but you don't think it's too bad, you know, but you realize you messed something up along the way and now you have to go back in. So, I guess, yeah. So I get really kind of focused on like making sure every single word, like you said, is where I want to be. Even in academic stuff, I try to do that too, probably to my own detriment. And so sometimes, you know, but once you edit it, that means like you've got to like put down a sentence that you know isn't going to work yet, and it's going to read badly in relation to the whole draft, and then. So, you know, for every sentence now you got to rewrite. I have to rewrite each sentence 2 or 3 times now again, you know? And so, you know, it's just, and I tend to read the entire manuscript from start to finish as I'm redrafting and re-editing. So that way the whole thing flows. Yeah, maybe some of it's just my own inefficiencies and method, but that's my method. And so, you know, it becomes, it becomes kind of scary to say, okay, like we're going to go back in and you're not going to give up until you get it right, you know, and yeah, you have to be willing to do that. So.
Yeah. And I mean, you might call it inefficiency, but for me, I think your writing process and your editing process makes your story really stand out, because when I was reading along, like something briefly mentioned at the first start of the story will be like perfectly tied in at the end of the story, or like brought in really well. And so thank you for sharing about your editing process and how you went about making this story.
That's the other thing too. That's like I learned with like fiction writing that isn't necessarily always the case with academic writing. Is like I might put in a little detail that I think is super cool on like page 6, but then you realize that detail on page 6 doesn't align really all that well with that detail on page 1 or 2, you know. And so like you've got to check for all those too, right? Check for all those consistencies. What do they call it in like narrative theory? Narrative, it's not fidelity, it's something else. There's a word that like internally the narrative has cohesion, right? Narrative cohesion. Like there has to be consistency between the elements of the narrative so that it feels like it's accurate. So.
And just as we begin to wrap up, I have only one or two more questions. First, I'm wondering if you are currently working on anything else, any other fiction stories?
Yeah, I don't know what it is yet. I also don't want to repeat the same patterns, but I'm obviously there's a repeat the same themes, but there's obviously like a question I'm interested in, right? Which is present in that story. And so, but I don't know. I had recently been brought back to another earlier moment in my life. So I had noticed a parallel. Like I'd had this experience recently, and for whatever reason, I had been kind of transported back to kind of this moment when I was 5 or 6 in North Carolina, and really like a moment I hadn't thought about too much, but I think it's pretty pivotal in my existence. Like I said, I'll be going back to North Carolina for a family reunion in this summer. And so I think I'm going to do that same thing of like try to go to this place of this event. And it's not even like a crazy event. It was like this thing where like my mom had dropped me off for a school dance at like 6 years old. And I was like, I don't know, or maybe I was older than that. Must have been 6th grade. I mean, middle school, yeah. But I remember like I just like couldn't go in. Like I couldn't do it. I couldn't like I was like 6th grade. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't go in. And so I don't remember why. I don't remember what, but I just like walked around the back and like spent the entire night on this little hill by myself, right? And it's kind of, so it's like a weird, I don't know that I want to write about that, but I want to see what that emotion is and see what that feeling is, and then see what comes out of that, like probably set in North Carolina somehow. So
that's really cool. And I definitely think that sometimes writing out those little memories that you're trying to recall again that is a great, I guess, way to process the past and make sense of what happened.
Yeah, the processing is key. And it's, but that's the wound part too, right? Like that's the why the editing becomes tough too. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua, for your time today. I really enjoyed our discussion and was just so inspired by your story and your writing process. So I'm super excited for people to read your stories today on issue 1. And besides that, did you have any last words that you would like to share?
No, I should just thank you to everybody at Archetype for what you've been doing. I had a good feeling about submitting it to you. I had a good feeling about what is going on with you all and the work you're doing to organize this. And so I think that feeling has been proven justified. I often act off of feeling and hope that it works in the end. So the editorial process has justified my decision. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad. Well, thank you so much.